This is the Behind the Line podcast, coming to you from the wacky left coast capital of Seattle. News from the Pacific Northwest, the left coast, the U.S., and the world that matters. The stories the MSM won't talk about. Deciphering the truth through all the lies. For more, visit BehindTheLinePodcast.com.
Here they come after the guns. Some more. Since this administration has taken office, there has been a major push to ban guns. Blue states are also doing their best to push banning whatever guns they can. Here in Washington, all assault rifles and so-called high-capacity magazines, meaning any magazine holding more than 10 rounds, are banned now. Other blue states have similar laws. Of course, they do nothing to actually curb the violence they purport to stop. Criminals don't follow laws, so they continue to have access to and carry these weapons and magazines. The only people this really hurts is law-abiding citizens and their ability to protect themselves. Liberal loonies will never get this little gem of information through their collective heads, though. So until the political climate changes or a level-headed court overturns these laws, we are stuck with it. A couple of concerning things I see in the gun control fight that would be outside the usual methods of gun bans and restrictions are the ability for credit card companies or banks to say you can't use your credit card or funds to purchase guns or ammo. The other, more disturbing and newest attack is saying the Second Amendment doesn't protect your ability to buy guns. It only protects your right to have them. And how are you supposed to get them? They just appear as magic? Several banks and credit card companies over the last couple years have decided that they will not allow you to use your card to purchase guns and/or ammunition. They've also restricted funding and financing for businesses that sell guns. Banks are restricting their credit card and banking services to gun retailers and halting lending to gun makers that do not comply with age limits and background check rules determined by the banks. Yes, the banks. Don't you want some paper-pushing, limp noodle banker telling you what your background check should look like? They're also freezing out businesses that see high-capacity magazines and bump stocks. Citigroup and Bank of America being two of the biggest to enact these policies. My main concern, though, is the newest angle that at least one 86-year-old federal judge in Colorado, appointed by Jimmy Carter, believes, is that the Second Amendment doesn't protect your right to buy a gun. It only protects your right to possess one. That seems completely ludicrous. Obviously, to possess a gun, you must buy it, since they don't just magically appear out of thin air. Besides the obvious reason this is a problem, them just being able to say we can't purchase guns because we have no right is the less obvious problem, the one that could affect many other gun-related court cases. In any case, where they are trying to limit our rights with guns or change the rights, they have to be able to look back in history and show an example of how it was this way or that in the past and compare it to our situation now. With many of these cases presently, they are unable to do that because these issues were never addressed in the past, which means their cases fall apart in court and go nowhere. With this little parlor trick, they are attempting to use it to eliminate the need for this historical proof or reference by just saying this particular right, the right to purchase, is not protected by the Second Amendment. They don't have to reference it to any past example. The founders never specifically said anything about the right to purchase because anyone with common sense knows that this is inferred. To have a firearm must be bought, generally, or stolen. I'm sure they felt it was unnecessary to lay out every minor detail, but this is how our society works now. Splitting hairs to get what you want, to bend the law to make it work for you or your agenda, eliminating any common sense whatsoever. I worked as a police officer for 8 years. I was certified in several different types of investigations. I was a field training officer as well. I owned a private investigation business for many years and worked in 2 counties as a defense investigator. I also worked as a fugitive recovery agent for almost 20 years. I have dealt with criminals and people in general nearly my entire adult life and made hundreds of arrests during these years. I know a little about criminals and life on the streets and how they think and act. Politicians don't. Surprisingly, judges don't seem to either, or more likely, they encourage the chaos so that more restrictions on the rest of us can be ushered in. What I can tell you is there is a huge mental health crisis in this country. Politicians choose to ignore it. Most, if not all, these gun crimes are caused by mentally ill people or criminal organizations and gangs. Nearly every mass shooting you can attribute to a mentally ill person, a person that law enforcement was almost always aware of, had them on the radar, or had already dealt with them in some capacity. And yet they continue to slip through the cracks. Why don't they start treating the mentally ill? Why don't we go back to having mental facilities? The federal government cut most of the funding for these back in the 90s. Why? We spend hundreds of millions of dollars on homeless, most of who are also mentally ill, with zero results. If you treated the mental illness and drug addiction in the case of homeless, it's reasonable to say these people would not want to stay on the streets. These people would not want to go shoot up a school. And if they couldn't be treated and are displaying violent tendencies or motivations, they got locked up in a mental hospital until they're deemed safe. Also, eliminating mass shootings. Politicians and courts continue to tie law enforcement's hands and or refuse to prosecute people who should be prosecuted. We have a crime epidemic sweeping the country. At the same time, most large cities have the lowest number of police they have seen in decades. If this isn't planned, how else can you really explain it? Guns don't shoot themselves. A gun in itself is not inherently dangerous. The person who has control over it is. The person who pulls the trigger is. Lunatics who want to kill someone are going to find a way regardless of a law. And if they don't have access to a certain kind of gun, they'll find another way. If you don't address the lunatics and criminals, none of this is going to change. These crimes will continue to go on. They're going to continue to increase. Looking around at everything that's happening, one could reason that it's all just part of the plan. From chaos comes control.
Thank you for listening to the Behind the Line podcast. If you like this broadcast, please like and share it. Please follow us on Facebook, Rumble, YouTube, Twitter, Truth Social, Telegram, Gab, Parler, and LinkedIn. You can find our podcast at BehindTheLinePodcast.com, NetNewsNetwork.net, and on Anchor, Spotify, Amazon Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and anywhere podcasts can be found. Thank you for your support.